Democrats and Republicans, the two major political parties in the United States. But what are exactly their differences? Today we'll be exploring some of the main aspects of how Democrats and Republicans are different in terms of their political ideology, their appeal, and much more. First up, an introduction. Democrats and Republicans are the two major political parties in the United States, at least quote-unquote major, alongside with other minor parties, but most of them you haven't really heard of, such as the Libertarians, Greens, and Constitutional parties. But really, we're all only talking about these two parties because those are the parties with the most votes. But what are exactly the differences between these two parties? In today's video, we will be analyzing some of the key aspects and really talking about how these two political parties are very, very different. First off, the U.S. political parties. Democrats are the largest left-leaning / liberal political party in the United States. They are largely progressive as they are, quote, Democrats and liberals. They use a donkey logo because Andrew Jackson was marked as a donkey by people who did not like him, but he actually embraced the symbol, and thus this became the logo of the Democratic Party. They use the blue color despite other liberal parties in the world pretty much all using the red color. Now for the Republicans, or GOP, they are the right-leaning political party in the United States. They have a conservative ideology, and they use a elephant logo because that's just what it happens that they use, and the red color despite most conservative parties such as the Tories in the UK using the blue color, they use the red color. Now for their appeal and support. First up, the first analytical point is race. The GOP is favored among white voters, the only voting bloc they're favored upon in the United States voters. Now, however, white voters are 2/3 of the electorate, and Trump won them against Mr. Biden by 17 points in 2020. Democrats, however, get a lot of their support from minority voters. They won black voters, the second largest block of voters in 2020, by a substantial 75 percentage points. They also won Latino voters by 33 percentage points, Asian voters by 27 percentage points, and other racial / ethnic groups by 14%. And overall, minorities make up about 1/3 of the electorate in the United States. And Democrats won those voters by about 45% in 2020. Now, why is this race thing such a divisive issue? Well, Democrats are more for things like equality, which is more important to minorities because they have been historically discriminated against, while white voters, they don't really care about the issue as much, and thus prefer the Republican Party by around 17 points. Now, age. Now, as you can see, younger voters typically prefer Mr. Biden or the Democrats, and the older voters typically prefer candidates that are in the Republican Party or Donald Trump. In 2020, Biden won the youngest voting bloc, or 18 to 29 voters, by a margin of 24 points. He won the 30 to 44 bloc by a margin of 6 points, and Trump won the 45 to 64 bloc by just a point, and the 65 and older bloc by a margin of 5 points. However, it is noticeable that the voting bloc with the lowest amount of voters are the 18 to 29 bloc, which is also the largest difference between the two candidates at 24 points. Now, typically, younger people are typically more progressive in their ideologies, and older people are typically more conservative. So it makes sense that Democrats typically win the younger voters, and Republicans typically win the older voters. Now, by gender. Biden won the female voting bloc by 15 points, while Trump won the male bloc by 8 points in 2020. However, these two blocs are pretty similar in their populations. Males took about 48% of the electorate, while females took about 52%. Thus, by these numbers, you can clearly see that Biden did win the popular vote in 2020. Now, why is this the case that male voters typically prefer more Republican candidates, and females typically prefer Democratic candidates? Again, it's about equality. Typically, more progressive candidates are more for things like equality, such as women being able to vote and things like that. Thus, Mr. Biden did win the female vote, while Mr. Trump did win the male vote. Now, the area type. Urban areas typically vote for Democrats, and rural areas typically vote for Republicans. Biden, the Democrat, won urban areas in 2020 by 22 points, compared to Trump, who was the Republican, who won rural areas by 15 points. Now, suburban areas typically vote for Republicans by 1 or 2 points. However, this is an area that has shifted towards the Democratic Party. And in 2020, Biden did win suburbanites by 2%. However, notice that a majority of these voters are actually suburban voters, which makes elections very competitive because they are a very swing block of the population. Now, why is urban areas favoring Democrats and rural areas favoring Republicans? Well, typically in areas that are more urban, there are more progressive ideologies, and there's a lot of immigrants and stuff like that. Thus, it does typically help Democrats win those urban areas. Or rural areas, rural areas are less populated, but they do take a plurality of the ground in the United States. And Trump did win those voters by 15% because typically rural areas are contained with voters that are typically been long living in the United States. Thus, they typically prefer Donald Trump. Now, the ideologies and issues. What do the two parties support? Well, Democrats and Republicans are actually quite different in terms of what issues both parties support, and the US majority doesn't really agree with either political party that much. Democrats really favored issues like abortion, climate change, and marijuana usage, while Republicans are more against those issues. Meanwhile, Republicans are more supportive of right to carry the weapons, they are more pro-companies, and they also are more against large governments. Now, for the first issue, abortion, Republicans were the reason why abortion was overturned in the U.S. Supreme Court. Thus, Republicans are more against this issue, and Democrats are more for this issue. The U.S. majority typically favors abortions, but not as much as Democrats do. Climate action, Democrats are definitely favoring climate action. Republicans are a bit mad, but they typically still go on board. While the U.S. majority does favor the issue, but not as much as Democrats but more so than Republicans. Now, the right to carry, Democrats support restrictions. Republicans want pretty much the freedom of carrying firearms in pretty much any places without restrictions. The U.S. majority does lean in favor of firearms, but not as much as Republicans. Marijuana usage, Democrats are very favoring of that issue because they are progressive. Many of the voters are younger, thus they support this issue. Republicans mostly block it because they are more conservative and really more old-fashioned ideas. The U.S. majority does support this issue, but not as much as Democrats. Typically, the U.S. majority doesn't really support companies as much as workers, but Republicans do. The U.S. majority largely opposes the large government's idea, but Democrats want to expand governments. Equality, both the Democrats and Republicans agree that equality is an important issue, but typically Democrats could see this as a top issue, as things like race relations in 2020, many Democrats actually thought that was the top issue in an election. Republicans, however, are not as interested in this issue as other Democrats. Finally, is their electoral regional appeal. This is basically a simple political map. Now, this is quite simple because I did not include the likely or tilt characterizations, but typically, just to explain here, the safe states are states that Democrats and Republicans, or these really dark states, are areas that they consistently win, no matter what. The lean states are states that they still consistently win, but by lesser margins. The toss-up states or these brownish states are actually where the elections are really important, because both parties have a theoretical chance at winning those states. So what is the divide? Largely based on rural and urban areas. California, New York, for instance, has a lot of urban areas and a lot of immigrants, thus they have a larger Democratic population. While rural areas in rural states with lesser electoral votes, as you can see the numbers below the state names, these are areas where Republicans do better because more rural voters, more white voters, and thus better for the GOP. Anyways, this is my short analysis of politics in the US and really what the Democrats and Republicans differ on. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.